Dear students, in this module, we are going to talk about the rural society and based on what characteristics we can define the rural society or rurality. The term rural refers to the areas located outside the towns and cities. However, it varies from one country to another country that based on what characteristics, whether it could be the number of inhabitants or it could be the quality of life. So, based on what characteristics we can define the rural society in comparison to urban society. So, it has the characteristics like agricultural landscape, isolation from the facilities or maybe from the road infrastructure, and then small towns and having the low population density. So when we talk about these characteristics, there is not a consensus on these characteristics that where we can find the or where we can define the limit based on which we can identify that this can be considered particularly a rural society in comparison to urban one. So the society with low ratio of inhabitants, which can be dwelling in a very open land, or maybe most economic activities that are the production of foodstuff, fiber, or raw material. So it is difficult to define with the greater precision, specifically in the post-industrialization era, where it becomes more difficult because of the available globalization characteristics in rural societies as well. It becomes difficult to define the rural society. And second related problem is that governments usually do not use the homogeneous criteria or homogeneous statistics based on which a rural society can be distinguished from that of the urban society. For instance, in Japan, any population having lesser than 30,000 inhabitants can be considered the rural population, whereas the criteria changes in Albania, where only 400 inhabitants can make a rural population, and above 400 can be considered the urban population. So you see, it's a huge disparity between these criteria. National definitions of urban and rural areas differ from one country to another. It is difficult to compare these across the national borders, which becomes problematic when we try to compare different societies across countries and we try to define them from a very developmental perspective. For example, the issue was recently raised in the 2020 when United Nations, while indicating the SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals, for to distinguish them specifically both for both rural as well as urban areas. So this problem became very apparent. Therefore, to facilitate the international comparisons, 6 international organizations like EU, European Union, OECD, World Bank, FAO, and ILO as well, they all developed a new definition of cities and towns based on a homogeneous criteria. This method of defining is called the degree of urbanization. In its 51st session, the United Nations Statistical Commission endorsed this method of delineating the rural and urban distinction. So the degree of urbanization is identified based on 3 important characteristics. Number 1, cities which have a population of at least 50,000 inhabitants in with the dense grid of cells, like minimum 1,500 inhabitants per kilometer square. That's a yardstick to define the population density in the urban areas. Whereas then we have another distinction, which is the towns and semi-dense areas, which have a population of at least 5,000 inhabitants with the minimum population density of at least 300 inhabitants per square kilometer. So these 2 distinctions are very important to define the third one, which is the rural area, which mostly consists of any population lower than these two grades which we have already defined. So here is a glimpse of a comparison of rural and urban society. You can see that they can be reflected side by side.